skeleton crew of maybe a dozen guys. They were trying to figure something out. Around 1910, a guy named L.D. Gordon came up, and Gordon figured out, well, everybody was trying to mine all the silver, nobody's paying attention to the zinc. And so there's a mineral here called smithsonite, which is zinc carbonate, and he started mining zinc, and they mined zinc into the 1940s. And Gordon, when he was here, he built this two-story house here, and that's why the architecture is a little bit different. You figure 1860s versus 1910s, so there's 50 years between those. And Gordon ran the mine up into the 1940s. A couple things happened. One, the price of minerals were dropping. The World War shut down non-essential mines, and so that was kind of one of the death blows here. A mining company had it. They put a caretaker up here. He lived here for a couple years. They were behind on wages, so for back wages they gave him the town, and that is how it got into private ownership. And many generations later, I came to own it in 2018, so 6 years ago, 7 years ago, and I've been living up here full time since March of 2020, so 5 years now. And these days we're standing outside one of the original general stores, and so inside there's a lot of artifacts that are been left behind here or pulled out of the mines. You're welcome to check that out. Above here, one of the little, that's the assay building, and the assay building is where they used to test a lot of the quality of the silver. So there's a lot of mining equipment in that, and you're welcome to check that out too. Next to that is Lola's Palace of Pleasure, one of the original brothels here, owned by a woman named Lola Travis. And Lola was the entrepreneur of her day. She owned brothels in Lone Pine and Darwin and Panamint City, and so she was quite the entrepreneur back in the day. And yeah, next to that, the roller coaster looking thing, during the zinc era, so the second era, the 1910s, they put in an aerial tramway. So the tram used to originate right at that roller coaster looking thing that you see and go all the way down to Owens Lake, which is now a dry lake bed below. And they would send down the ore in buckets that you see similar to the side of the hill right here. And so those heavy buckets, would go down, and the weight of those would bring back up the empty buckets. And if miners were feeling particularly lazy, they could jump in the empty buckets down in Keeler and ride them back up. Which I think about is interesting, because that would have been before commercial airlines, and so nobody else in the world really had the experience of flying yet. And so I wonder how they explained that to friends. But yeah, that's kind of the quick spiel. We lost a building here in 2020 to an electrical fire, and we have since been rebuilding for the past 5 years. What you're looking at is the rebuild of the American Hotel, which hopefully this time next year you guys can be wandering through and hanging out on the deck and having a drink. The downstairs will be a bar and restaurant. The upstairs will be 6 rooms. There'll be wooden decks that are surrounding both this side and the outside to kind of stop and have a little snack if you guys are coming through. But with that, yeah, you guys are welcome to check out the museum.